So, Sarah, I have been asked to ask you, how was your weekend?
I had a lovely weekend. I went to see friend of the pod, Nancy Carroll, in Hamlet at the RSC in Stratford, where she is playing Gertrude to Luke Thallon's Hamlet. Fabulous cast. And the thing that we couldn't reveal when we interviewed both Nancy and Naya Towell, who is playing Ophelia, for a previous podcast, which is an excellent chat, is that it was set on a ship. So we had a hint that it was set on a ship because we'd seen a set that tipped. And in fact, I knew that it was set on a ship. And it's set on a sinking ship. So ship of state, ship of fools. Very like Triangle of Sadness, the rather brilliant film from a couple of years back. And I adored it. I don't think it's a Hamlet that solves all of the problems of the play. And indeed, the shipboard setting causes quite a lot of complications. But it's got a thrillingly propulsive energy that means that it's a Hamlet I think I will always remember, because I've rarely seen a Hamlet that literally sort of teeters to its ending so fast. One of the problems it causes itself is by setting itself over a single night. But obviously that's really exciting to watch, as well as a complication if you're a purist. And obviously Nancy is superb. Yared Harris is a really interesting Claudius. Naya is a terrific Ophelia. Elliot Levy is Polonius. Anton Lesser gives a masterclass in Shakespearean acting as both the ghost of Hamlet's father and as the player king. And I loved it. And I was really interested with Luke Thallon's Hamlet, which I thought was a terrific portrayal.
It was very amusing when we were recording the interview with Tamara Harvey and Daniel Evans in the RSC's rehearsal room, because just off shot was this gigantic ramp where they'd been rehearsing, and we weren't allowed to mention it at all. But it was like the set design elephant in the room was this huge ramp where, honestly, I have no idea how well their quads are faring, because standing on that stage with that level of incline for multiple hours a day, your legs would be screaming by the end of it, let alone voice or performance. It's a lesson in theatrical endurance. But it was striking how mixed the reviews were, that there were some people that really didn't take to this take that Rupert Goold had put behind the play. But actually, hearing you talk about it, it just almost feels like great conceptual sense. You know, having this group of elite aristocrats sort of be the architects of their own demise feels perfectly natural, and it feels like it's a really fantastic metaphor for both the state of Denmark, the rotten state of Denmark, but also perhaps the wider cultural elite that seems to exist.
Yeah, and it's the ship that's called Elsinore, which I thought was clever, and you have to change land to sea quite often in the text. And it's radically cut. There's some big, big chunks have gone. But the thing people seemed to object to most was Thallon's loss of metre. He does divide up the lines to make each speech seem as if he's thought of it on the spot, which was actually, I've very recently watched Andrew Scott's Hamlet, where he does a similar thing, but slightly more poetically than Luke. I mean, Luke Thallon absolutely makes it into prose, really. But he, to me, carries it off. You have to get used to it when it begins. But then, as it carries on, your ear attunes. And in fact, as the play progresses, he becomes more metered. That some of they move to be or not to be unusually late. And by that point, it seemed to me that he'd absolutely found the balance between minting the lines fresh and keeping some sense of poetry. So it's an unpoetic portrayal, but it is completely convincing. And he's very much in the moment, very frightened and frightening and slightly mad. I mean, I do think from the start he's mad, driven mad by the situation he finds himself in. And I was very persuaded. And it brings us really something else we're going to talk about this week about, fresh looks at things with big stars. But I like, Shakespeare's always going to be there on the page. And I like productions that are visceral and exciting and make me see something new. And I really thought that did.
Well, that feels like an ideal place to start this episode of the WhatOnStage podcast, at which point we should probably introduce ourselves. So I'm Alex Wood, the editor.
And I'm Sarah Crompton, the critic for WhatOnStage.
As you trailed, we wanted to talk a little bit about big stars coming to the stage and what effect that has on the theatre ecosystem, but also some of the big successes that we've seen, possibly in the last week or so, and some of the less successful takes that we've seen. And then we also might do a little bit of trailing for the Olivier Awards nominations, which should be coming up very soon.
Oh, yes, and we wanted to do a tiny bit of trailing backwards on our Oscar predictions because we're recording this the day after Timothée Chalamet has won the Screen Actors Guild Best Actor, which makes me feel that my prediction that he might steal the prize from Adrien Brody is becoming possible.
Well, Conclave also picked up some prizes last night, so who knows, my prediction that Conclave might win Best Picture now also feels like it's got a bit of steam. So we might both be right. We'll have to check in on the next episode.
Yeah, I'm definitely coming around to your view, actually, because I think that the combination of the Pope being so seriously ill, which makes it seem incredibly prescient and pressing, and the arguments surrounding the papacy and what will happen next. Conclave suddenly is moving towards the front of everybody's mind. And I was reading also that conservative voters, conservative with a small c, in the Oscar ballot are finding the sheer sexiness of certainly the first 30 minutes of Anora quite a challenge. So Conclave might just do it. It's going to be a really interesting Oscar night.
I would recommend anyone who hasn't listened to it, go back to last week's episode where we're joined by Theatre Mania's editor-in-chief David Gordon to reflect on the Oscar nominees. We took a sort of like dip into the pond of film speculation, but right now we're back in the world of theatre and London theatre in particular. But big stars on stage. And one of the connective tissues between the 2 weeks would be Adrien Brody, who is one of the big stars, who was on the London stage last autumn and gave an incredible performance in The Fear of 13 and is now hotly tipped to be one of the possible contenders for the Best Actor Oscar for The Brutalist. So it could be an Oscar Olivier year for Adrien Brody, which is probably something that hasn't happened too often. Like, I haven't dipped into the history records to find that. But yeah, I think, Sarah, where would you like to start in terms of thinking about how stars, the big names, Hollywood stars, interacting with the London theatre ecosystem creates something quite unique, but also something that should probably be interrogated around why these stars come to London, but also what happens when they do succeed and what happens when they don't succeed?
I think Adrien Brody is a brilliant example of when the symbiosis between big stars and the stage totally works. So he arrived at the Dunmore Warehouse to make his London stage debut. I went along. I didn't review it because I was away or something. And so I went along to a late matinee, quite sceptical that this Hollywood actor was going to be a good stage performer. And he was utterly riveting. And it changed my view of him as a performer, really, because it was so committed and so detailed and so utterly, utterly present that you just couldn't imagine anyone being better in that play. I think he definitely has to be a front runner for the Olivier. It keeps arising. So whether stars are improving the stage of the London stage or sucking energy from it. So in the last week, you and I, we've seen Rami Malek in Oedipus at the Old Vic. We've seen Brie Larson in Electra, Duke of York's, 2 Oscar winners, 2 successive nights. Then we've also watched Asa Butterfield in second best at the Riverside one-man show with, again, a TV star making a stage debut. And then we had, of course, what we waited for to have this conversation. We saw Tom Hiddleston and Hayley Atwell in Much Ado About Nothing, Shakespeare play, Drury Lane. And in this play, Jamie Lloyd, the director, actually makes the joke about celebrities being imported into Shakespeare by bringing on cutout models of Hayley Atwell as Peggy Carter and Tom Hiddleston as Loki. So they are actually interacting with their Hollywood persona on stage, which is cheeky and very classy and very, very funny. And we both loved, we loved That Much Ado, both of us, didn't we?
Yes, I think it was back-to-back Shakespeare, wasn't it? It was Jonathan Bailey doing Richard II and then Much Ado, which the scheduling gods either could have created a calamity for one of those productions if one of them was terrible and the other was amazing. But actually both were very fine central performances in action. That Much Ado, though, will go down probably as one of my greatest nights at the theatre. And I wrote a blog about this on Friday, how my first encounter with Much Ado wasn't actually at Theatre Royal Drury Lane. It was seeing the hundreds of TikToks and Instagram posts and X posts with Tom Hiddleston and Hayley Atwell dancing during the curtain call to Love Takes Over, performed brilliantly by Mason Alexander Park. They were performing When Love Takes Over by David Guetta, and it was huge dance moves, kind of like 12:30 at a wedding where two people clearly know how to dance, are very drunk and decide to take to the floor together. Nowadays, Jamie Lloyd is very good at knowing how to use a curtain call to create a viral moment and get people very excited about a show. And it's so galvanizing seeing a director and a production take Shakespeare and find new and exciting ways to make it even more brilliant. And that's on one level. Actually, I think what you talk about so brilliantly in your review is the other levels on which this production operates and the way in which the performances operate. That isn't just glib, like big night at a party. It's something more profound and interesting in terms of the ways that it has treated the characters of Benedict and Beatrice.
Yeah, I work with my niece who adores Much Ado About Nothing, and it's her favourite play, so it's high-risk gamble. And she was anxious, about it because in the way that you do when you love a play, she wanted it to reveal things. And absolutely, from the moment it started, we were both entranced. And it's radical. Again, throws out loads of text. It's covered in pink confetti. There's a lot of dancing. There's a lot of audience interaction. So, when Tom Hiddleston says, "I am beloved of all women," he comes to the front of the stage and stands there and just takes in the applause and winks. And it's incredibly confident in its handling of his persona and of Atwell's persona. But what I loved and respected about it was it does all of that, and yet its reading of the key scenes of that play is scholarly and truthful and revealing, and it finds all kinds of beats and notes within the text that are absolutely there and are absolutely justified. And it's rich. So it's rich in every way, and it's also incredible fun. I can't remember a Shakespeare comedy where I've laughed so much for a long time. And as you say, the exuberance of the dancing, the exuberance of the performances, combined with the fact that as the play gets darker, so do the performances. They become more nuanced. And Atwell, I think, I've always loved her as an actor. I really mourn, though I'm sure she doesn't, because she's obviously had a lot of fun doing it. I interviewed them before the run started, and she's had a lot of fun doing Mission Impossible for 5 years. But I mourn her absence from the stage because I think she is an amazing stage performer and has got, which I did try to describe in my review, this ready access to emotion that she, without forcing it, you just feel what she's thinking all the time. And she's brilliant, and he's a superb Shakespearean. His command of the language, the way that he, pauses, this great moment where he says, she loves me. And, there's this wonderful sense of playing with the lines and absolutely being in it. And I think everybody was so delighted, A, because it's brilliant in itself, but B, The Tempest, which was the previous Jamie Lloyd production on the stage at Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, starring Signori Weaver, had called into question the whole notion of star casting. Not necessarily for me or you, but there was a lot of chat about it because that didn't work. And Weaver couldn't command the stage in the same way, for whatever reason.
It was, to some extent, Jamie Lloyd's redemption when it comes to Shakespeare productions, because I think some people also weren't massively enamoured with Romeo and Juliet with Tom Holland. But this really just proved that he clearly does have a pretty solid grasp of the text. And you could argue, and he did mention this in an interview with WhatOnStage, that he's also now got the measure of the Drury Lane stage, as in he knows how to work that space. And it's funny how the set doesn't feel big, but actually the use of confetti throughout actually made it feel very busy on stage. It never felt empty because you've got this constant trickle of colour and light and entertainment and froth. It actually worked really well in the space, despite the fact that it wasn't, some huge, lavish northern Italian villa or whatever. It was something very non-specific and abstract, yet still very colourful and exciting and rich. And on the point about Hayley Atwell, she reminded me of a young Maggie Smith to some extent in her masterful use not only of the text, but also of her own comportment to some extent. She starts off incredibly steely. There's a lot of dance early on, but you can see the way that she melts across the two acts of the show, and the way that by the end she's so much more tactile and so much more emotive. And for me, I'd say that between the two of them, they really showed up how incredible Shakespearean performance can be on a stage. And when done by people who understand Shakespeare's lines and have worked with a creative team that can signpost all the right things about Shakespeare, you can turn it into a big crowd pleaser. Watching Tom Hiddleston do some of the comedy notes reminded me quite a lot of Hamid Animation's Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream at the Bridge, which has, and Nick Heitner's production there had probably the best Act 5 of Midsummer Night's Dream I've ever seen in my life. And it's coming back to the Bridge actually later this year, which is very exciting. But that for me was proof of the comedic power of Shakespeare. And I think that that's an incredibly important lesson when Shakespeare is taught in a very fusty and sterile environment. The vast majority, to actually see it come alive in the way that it does in a Jamie Lloyd production is so wonderful. And you just imagine how many thousands of people are making their first trip to the West End or their first trip to see a Shakespeare play. It turns out to be this one, as opposed to perhaps people whose first Shakespeare trip would be to see The Tempest. I think having the two as bedfellows shows just how, even with the same creative team, Shakespeare can be done in such different ways and with such different results.
Yeah, and I think that's utterly right. And I mean, everybody gets anxious about this, the Jamie Lloyd season, partly because the top price tickets are very expensive. And it is expensive. And I do always say you should look at football prices as well. West End theatres and football prices have not separated that far over the years. It's to do with the relentless drive of capitalism rather than anything else. But I do think, as an introduction, there are always cheap tickets available. It is always possible to get school parties in. And it is a brilliant introduction to Shakespeare because of how they understood it. And I think comedy's harder to bring off in some ways than tragedy. That Susanna Clapp made a very interesting point in her Observer review this week, which is that actually for all that we say Benedict and Beatrice are the great Shakespearean lovers, sometimes they can come across as brittle and unhappy, really sour, because it's a relationship that has gone wrong before it goes right. Whereas this, they managed to do that thing which I always love on the stage of just suggesting that actually it had gone wrong, but it was there was a tug of attraction underneath that would make it all come all right in the end. And I thought they were both superb at that. And a lot of that, this is slightly off the point, but a lot of that is in their physicality. They are both very comfortable in how they move on a stage, and how, therefore, right from the beginning, even before there's a very funny dance scene where they're both wearing huge masks, and Hiddleston's got this kind of dog mask on, which has got a lolling tongue, and he just looks sad. It's brilliant, device again. But they move so well towards each other. There's a sense of ease around each other's bodies, and I do think that makes a difference about suggesting sexual attraction. And it is all acting, you don't get it. Having sat with them in a rehearsal room, they're not like that. These are performances, and that's what's so brilliant and exciting about it.
Moving from Captain Carter and Loki to another member of the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the form of Brie Larson, Captain Marvel, if Hayley Atwell and Tom Hiddleston were introducing new audiences to Shakespeare, I guess you could say that Brie Larson would probably be introducing new audiences to the classics in the form of Daniel Fisher's production of Elektra, which received relatively tepid write-ups, though one of its staunch defenders, I think I would say, is your very self, Sarah.
I'm prepared to make a case for it. I think in terms of it is a very eccentric production, and it doesn't feel to me as if it's finished. It felt as if they were still in the middle of rehearsing it, and it was still at the stage where you were flinging every idea you'd got about the play onto the stage. But I did think there were aspects of it that were interesting and electrifying and enjoyable. The chorus is particularly good. And I like Larson. I feel she struggles a bit with the concept of the part, which is that Elektra is angry at the start and she stays angry right to the end. And I think there is an issue there about modulation, and she doesn't get much chance to do anything other than shout. And she shouts no a lot and shouts no into a microphone a lot. It's an alienating production. But I think the thing I liked about it was it's trying things. I'm always inclined to like things that try things more than things that don't. And I thought there were elements of it that were deeply intriguing. And it was just that it doesn't feel as if it all comes together. It's a bit like loads of stuff just being thrown. But I think the thing, just to return to the star casting theme, I think the thing is that she perhaps isn't experienced enough to overcome the problems in the production. Rami Malek, I felt, just struggled really as an actor. It's not to do with the fact that he's a star at many levels. He's good casting for Oedipus. I was intrigued to see his Oedipus, but he doesn't quite seem to slide under the surface of the part. And I think what the problem with star casting is just like every other piece of casting. It's whether the actor in the end can get to grips with the part. And I'm not sure that stars suffer any more than any other actor at some levels. Star casting has always happened.
There is something quite humanizing about seeing a Hollywood star who has a incredibly well curated image, overseen by a huge publicity team, go out onto a stage and suddenly be incredibly exposed and sometimes just not very good. It's actually quite nice to know that sometimes outside of that more artificial world of film where you can have 20 takes to get the right performance, on the night you just might not be up for it, or you just might not be in the right frame of mind, and it might then reflect a bad performance. If anything, I'm now more appreciative of Larson because she gave it a go, and I doubt an experimental production of Elektra would have got onto the stage in the West End without a name like her, which opens up a huge can of worms about the West End and what can be programmed and what can't be programmed. That, for the production, watching it, what Daniel Fish had made, if that had been at Summerhall at the Edinburgh Fringe, and it had been Daniel Fish directs Elektra with an ensemble cast at Summerhall in the main space, I would have thought, brilliant. genius. I would probably have given it 3 or 4 stars and thought, well, it's more performance art than theatre, but it's at the fringe, so I think it's a pretty decent version of a Greek classic. But because it's in the West End, the conversation you have to have with the show changes, and because it's Larson in it, something about it changes. And I think that's also something to do with having a star in the cast. So it's a fascinating case study then about what does star casting do to a production in terms of how it is perceived not only by audiences but also by critics and by journalists as well, because I think journalists do treat shows with big stars differently, much to our fault sometimes. I think we are drawn towards the big names like moths drawn to a flame.
Yeah, and of course we've got the really big one coming up, which is The Seagull, which opens at the Barbican next week, which is, there isn't not a star in it. So it's Kate Blanchett and Cody Smith-McPhee and Tom Burke and Tanya Reynolds and Emma Corrin. I mean, it's just unbelievably starry. It's even got a star director in the shape of Thomas Ostermeyer. So, that will again open everything up. I think what you're saying is really wise, that a lot of this is to do with getting the show on at all. And again, that's historic. If you look at the famous Richard Burton Hamlet on Broadway, which Jack Thorne made the play, the motive and the cue about, I mean, that was a classic piece of star casting in order to do Hamlet on Broadway. Nobody was really very interested in seeing Mr. Unknown be Hamlet, but everybody wanted to see Richard Burton directed by John Gielgud. So it's not a new phenomenon. That's the first thing. And it does have to do with people thinking audiences will come in. I also think, having done this for a long time, that the way the media treat it has become incredibly problematic. I mean, the cues for Tom Holland's Romeo and Juliet were like the Burton scenes. I mean, the famous scenes of Burton and Taylor having to fight their way through the crowds. You got that with Tom Holland, Spider-Man as Romeo. But what then slightly happens is that all the attention of the coverage falls on the star. And that, I think, is damaging. So it was really true that Tom Holland was acted off the stage by his co-star. I didn't think he was bad. I thought he was perfectly all right. But he was acted off the stage by his Juliet, Francesca Amawuda Rivers, who was just amazing. And yet she got very little coverage and a lot of flack. I mean, that was the most unpleasant aspect of that production. But the lack that the company had to actually issue a statement to protect her from the online hatred. And I think that's damaging. And I think if Jamie Lloyd had announced a production of Romeo and Juliet with 2 completely unknown actors in it, it would have received no coverage in the press. It would have got reviews because that still persists. But in terms of preview coverage, in terms of actually selling tickets, it's much harder now for any journalist at any level to get a preview piece about an unknown into a publication. And that worries me.
I was talking to a publicist about Baz Bamigboy, who used to be at the Daily Mail and used to announce every exclusive under the sun, much to the chagrin of aspiring journalists like myself, who would watch as he would destroy any of the gossip or hearsay or embargoed releases you'd had by announcing it early. One thing, though, that Baz always used to do is he used to do exactly what you said, in that he would dedicate a whole page to an unknown rising star, say like a Sam Tutty going into Dear Evan Hansen. And because he had such a huge following and a prolific recognition, he would be able to do that at the Daily Mail. And very few journalists would be able to say, no, we're going to give a whole page to this random actor that no one will have heard of because we know he's going to be the next big thing. Part of the reason that he becomes the next big thing is because he has those pages. So it's a catch-22 kind of situation. If we keep chasing the Hollywood stars, we never get the next Sam Tutty. We get some incredible talents that can exist exclusively within the theatre silo, but none of them are ever going to break out and become the next Hannah Waddingham or the next Jonathan Bailey, because there isn't that chance to really build momentum for their career anymore because, like you say, arts columns are being whittled down and people are obsessed with the big names that are very SEO friendly online. It's quite a demoralizing situation, I guess.
I think that is the really bad aspect of it. And one of my first jobs on the Telegraph magazine was to run a column called Limelight, which existed entirely to promote people you'd never heard of across all the arts. So we used to do musicians, dancers, actors, directors, film actors. It was brilliant. And all I had to do was have a hunch about somebody, or a clever publicist who would say, this person's going to be a star. And our hit rate was extraordinary. I mean, to the point where eventually we did an exhibition of the stars because we had done really well on predicting people who would rise. I mean, Katie Lang, I remember being one. And, they came up. We managed to choose the winners. And Rachel Weisz, we did. I mean, it was brilliant. It was a brilliant, brilliant column. And I don't think anything like that exists anymore, because also we spent quite a lot of money on it. So we photographed them. They look like stars and they look like somebody who was about to step into the limelight. It definitely doesn't exist. And it does break my heart as a freelance journalist, not in terms of what's on stage, but I will quite often say, I think this person is going to be brilliant because I have seen them rise and I can't get anyone interested. That may also just because, commissioning editors hate me. I mean, I'm not going to say it's just about them. But it's much, much harder. They want them to have been on telly. They want them to have done something. So that's a difficult thing. The other thing I think that is difficult about it is whether what you've just mentioned and what Ethan Hawke mentioned, whether you need a certain number of Instagram followers or TikTok followers to help you get cast in the first place. That's another worrying trend that is beginning to come in and will be complicated for casting directors.
It's funny that you mentioned casting directors because that was where I was just about to go in terms of Jonathan Bailey as a case study, because pre-Bridgerton, he'd had some pretty solid TV roles, few and far between, but he was a regular stage presence with credits like Company or The York Realist. The moment that Bridgerton happens, his profile is through the roof in terms of suddenly he is the next big thing, the rising star in the British media world. And now, look at Jurassic World, Wicked, Bridgerton still going, and Lord knows what other projects he's got in the boot. It's the casting directors that actually have to be the ones now that have to kind of do some of what the journalists had to do in terms of going, ruffling through the undergrowth to find those big names that could be the next big thing. But it just means that journalists aren't helping them out anymore, as in we're not allowing them to have those profiles that are easily searchable. And it just makes it a lot harder for actors because it's much harder to stand out anymore compared to how it used to be.
It makes television, particularly now, I think the driving force of fame much more.
It's so sad.
Well, maybe inevitable, but it's sad for us, and it's very hard for those actors who are working their way through the fringe or smaller productions and giving their weight and their talent to smaller productions, because unless they get even a tiny part on telly or a larger part in a big telly like Bridgerton, like Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon, because a lot of actors in their 20s, in their early part of their career, are desperate for something like that because that gives them a recognizable thing. And then that comes out in the brackets on press releases. And they've somehow established themselves. So it's a new world, but I'm not sure that the West End and the sense of star casting in the West End is necessarily the problem. And I would say that we as audiences at some levels benefit from that. The Asa Butterfield, that was a case in point. Small play, on for a month, got on, I think, because he was in it. Brilliant notion about being second best in your life. Quite subtle, psychological study. And I hope it gets more of a life. And it was lovely to see him on stage. He was terrific. And it was, worth seeing. It was a good night out. And so we are beneficiaries of it as well as victims. I mean, Signori Weaver, I think, though I know a lot of people who quite enjoyed that Tempest. I didn't, but there you go.
But I think the context of new writing is a very useful one to think about these star casts. The other play that opened recently with 3 big stars in it, being Nicola Walken, Stephen Mangan and Erin Doherty, was Unicorn, which is Mike Bartlett's brand new play, opening cold into the West End. Very few playwrights, even of Mike Bartlett's calibre, can open a play direct into the West End without a star. And actually, these stars putting their weight behind new writing, as was the case with Second Best with Asa Butterfield, means that those writers get a bit more sort of oxygen and get a few more hours in the limelight. So that's not a bad thing. So maybe we're pivoting around to finding context where it's okay. But actually, when you were talking about the motive and the cue, we had 3 of the biggest TV and stage stars attached to that, playing Richard Burton-John Gielgud and Elizabeth Taylor in the form of Johnny Flynn, Mark Gatiss and Tuppence Middleton, each bringing their own draw and their own sort of like screen credits. So are we in a place where you need a big name for new writing to sell a big stage production, or can shows get by without a big name? If would something be on the Olivier stage if it didn't have some big casting attached to it? If maybe something like Ballet Shoes, but even then you've got someone like Pearl Mackie who's got quite a strong following in the cast. What is the process when a programmer is thinking about, oh gosh, I've got this huge new play, I really need someone big in it in order to fill the seats? Is that the reality that venues have to face now, or can they get by thinking, well, audiences will come because they're interested in the title and they're interested in the playwright?
I think that makes a very neat segue into our Olivier Awards predictions, because I think the subsidised houses like the National can still get away with it. One of my absolute frontrunners for best revival of the year will be Dear Octopus in the National, which was an ensemble cast led by Lindsay Duncan, who is, well known, but not, I guess, Signori Weaver famous. So I think you need people who can do it. I do think that you come back to that. One of the marvellous things about Dear Octopus was that the entire cast could do it. I mean, wonderful cast. And I think that's has to be the criteria. On the other hand, Giant by Mark Rosenblatt, which will come up for, I think, in the Olivier's for Best New Play. I'm not sure that would have got on without John Lithgow in the leading part. And he did do that amazing thing of making you think nobody else but him could have played Roald Dahl. He was just such a good fit for the part. So it's kind of complicated.
Yeah, it's a play like The Years I'd almost offer as a rebuttal, because it's got, like you say, solid Lindsay Duncan-esque names. You've got Romola Garai, Gina McKee, Anjali Mahindra. But at the same time, it's essentially an ensemble piece led by 5 brilliant talents. And the show itself is the star. None of the stars themselves are above the title there. So maybe that's a case where a show without big, huge Hollywood stars can thrive in the West End and probably thrive at the Olivier nominations as well.
Romola Garai did actually write this really interesting piece in The Guardian about how exciting it was to be an ensemble, which is completed by Deborah Finlay and Harmony Rose Bremner, and being at the service of the play rather than being above them. The play is the star in a sense. Garai's had a terrific year with that and with Giant. Let's not talk about stars, but she really has had an amazing year.
Talking about the Oliviers, I just wonder whether or not they'll try and get all 5 of those nominated in one category. Otherwise, you're going to have 5 supporting performers each vying for 4 spots, and it feels almost unfair to try and single out 1 or 2, because the way that they exist in that play is so symbiotic. It would be hard to pull out one and say, yep, she's the best. But that's probably what will end up happening. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I'd bend the rules if I was an Olivier judge. I've done a lot of theatre judging down the years. I would bend my rules to have a single nomination for 5 actors there, because you can't really separate out one single figure. It would be invidious to do so. What are your other strong feelings? What else do you think will be in there?
I think that we've got a third year on the trot where musical revivals are the most exciting thing that will be on the nominations list, in that you've got Jordan Fine's brilliant revival of Fiddler on the Roof going toe-to-toe with Cameron Mackintosh and Matthew Bourne's incredible take on Oliver versus Luke Sheppard's revival of Starlight Express. And on top of that, you've got Dominic Cook's Hello Dolly and Bartlett Sher's Kiss Me Kate. So, that's 5 shows I've listed, and there's only 4 maximum in that category. So someone's going to lose out. But also sometimes the Olivier goes down to 3 shows for Best Musical Revival. So that could cause a few problems.
I think that's only when they haven't got enough. I think this year has been such a strong year for musical revivals. I think the problem will be dropping one. I think it's Kiss Me Kate, in my opinion, will probably lose out on that.
That's a clash of the titans there in their 2 big shows.
Interesting. A new musical, Benjamin Button, it seems to have got a huge amount of support behind it.
A triumph for Off West End again after Operation Mincemeat last year, because that picked up Best New Musical after and Best Supporting Performer, Best Supporting Actor in a Musical for Jack Malone after a number of runs. Off West End came into the West End and has been a mighty force, and it'll be brilliant to see The Curious Case of Benjamin Button repeat that trend of having an Off West End run, then coming into the West End, then being heavily garlanded at the Oliviers. So I'd love for that to win. I think it's a very wholesome, beautiful, unique musical, almost more of a chamber musical than some of the heavy, big blockbuster shows that sit alongside it in the West End. So, and it'd be very classy for that to win. And it'd be nice to say to audiences that they can get something a bit different.
There's also Natasha and Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, which again is a very classy show. And I'd like to see that at least nominated. And I'm sure it will be, I think. It's a strong year. I hope Oedipus, Robert Icke's production of Oedipus with Mark Strong and Leslie Manville, who must be contenders in their respective acting categories, but that's got to be Best Revival. It's the one that most sticks out for me, apart from Dear Octopus, which I accept maybe a minority taste, but I do love it. And the other revival, of course, which I think will trouble the acting categories as well, is Licia Masmati and Ben Whishaw in James MacDonald's production of Waiting for Godot, which was, in my opinion, an outstanding revival of a play that is often revived and is often not very good.
And then you've also got Dominic West's A View from the Bridge, which transfers in from Bath and was a huge hit last summer. Whether or not it has the legs to stay through to the Oliviers is another question, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, it might do. And that had Naya Towlin, so that would be good. I'm all up for her.
I would love, on the acting side, we mentioned Naya Towlin, who is certainly a rising star, but another rising star would be Chimisa Donford-May in Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet. In fact, so many of the cast members in Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812 fully would deserve nominations. You've got Jamie Moscato, Declan Bennett, Mamoon and Mammon, all of whom were so captivating in that show. It's just whether or not it gets the voters in, and I guess that's a numbers game. But yeah, it's nice. I don't feel as though the Oliviers will be pandering to the big Broadway shows that were imported, as they may have done pre-pandemic, and I just don't think they do it anymore.
Yeah. Oh, Devil Wears Prada, is that going to get in there?
Possibly. But then you've also, you've got MJ, you've got Mean Girls, shows like that even Slave Play, the most Tony nominated play ever when it was first on, doesn't feel like it's very much of a front runner this time. So it does feel as though the Olivier panel or British theatre is looking to its own a bit more than looking over to America to see what's being. Although I would argue that Titanic might have a strong chance in Best Entertainment or Comedy, and I'm going to rip up this argument next year when Stereophonic picks up a huge number of nominations. That's already my prediction for 2026 before we even get through 2025. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing, hopefully, some rising stars being nominated, and probably a few Hollywood stars also in the mix with Adrien Brody and John Lithgow.
Adrien Brody will be there, definitely. And Lithgow. We will return to the subject when the nominations are actually announced, which is on
the 4th of March, apparently, because they haven't officially announced that. But by the time this podcast goes out, hopefully they will have done.
Okay. So we're returning to the theme. But for now, perhaps that's time to say that's enough and wrap up this episode of the What's on Stage podcast with me, Sarah Crompton.
And me, Alex Wood. Make sure you like, follow, subscribe, rate, or comment the podcast wherever you can. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode as we plough on through a very exciting year in UK theatre.